Thank you very much. We have several sea days coming up, so I have a little bit of an announcement. When you get to Ghana, you are going to see in the market just huge displays of beads. Those are called Krobo beads, and we're going to have an informal little session somewhere. I don't know yet where. Jeremy's going to plan it, but we're going to. I brought some samples of bracelets that I made because I could not resist these wonderful beads. They are made from Coke bottles. They pulverize the bottles, and then they recook them and make the beads from them. And there's also beads they're going to call amber, which I will explain to you what they really are. They are chemically very close to amber, but they're actually not. They're a resin. And there are beads of horn, and you will be overwhelmed if you go to the market by the beauty of these beads. And so I'm going to explain to you how you can use those beads for those of you who may be creative. I'm not creative, but what I did is I looked up after I just couldn't resist the beads. So I bought a lot of beads and then learned to make bracelets out of them. I could not get to the necklace stage. I'm not that creative. Today we're going to talk about the intersection of art and religion. And as we know, in our own culture, art and religion are quite close. There is religious art and there is secular art. And this is Benin bronzes. And you may have read about the Benin bronzes. They're in Britain. And the Benin government wants to repatriate them and to make a museum and to bring them. Some of them go back to the 13th and 14th century, so they predate the explorations and contact with the Portuguese and with Western Europe. The Benin bronzes were a secular form of art, and what they show is that the West Africans did have a type of art that was realistic. They could actually make, and they did in various times, make portraits of people, of specific individuals that had personality and had their own features. That's not what we normally associate with the arts of West Africa. We usually associate the arts of West Africa with these masks that became the early Cubist art. Now that is just to show you a parallel. It is a cultural trait of humanity to combine art with religion. And in Christianity, we see that a lot. I mean, we see religious art. You go to a cathedral, you go to a church, and you see paintings. You see beautiful pieces of silver, of gold, and such. And we also use relics. And this on your left there is a relic. It is a piece of the skull of Saint Balbina. And anyone who's traveled, particularly in Eastern Europe, will know that in the back of every church there is a place called the treasury. And the treasury is where they keep relics. And those are relics, those are pieces of saints. In some cases they have whole skeletons of saints under the altar that you will see, and this is particularly visible in the East, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the earlier churches that take place. So this is not an unusual trait of humanity, is to want to internalize, to take the spirit of someone who has come before, or some living being that has had a particular kind of trait. Now, the earliest The earliest religious and secular art, we don't know what the art was, that we find is from South Africa near Cape Town, and it is in the Blombos Cave, and it's been found recently, and it goes back 40,000 years. That's the oldest cave drawings that we have ever found, and this is what the excavation, they're protecting the cave. The cave faces the sea, and inside there are cave drawings and artworks. We don't know what that artwork was for, whether it was religious, whether it was secular, but it is ancient artwork that is decorative. And shells, various kinds of shells that were obviously worked in order to be decorative for humans to wear around their neck, and to either they may have had a spiritual aspect to them, but we don't know. The ethnographic collections, these were collected in Africa and collected all over the world and simply stuffed into museums. When they were collected, nobody really cared what these objects were for, and to this day some of these objects that are used in Africa and West Africa today are unknown and not very well understood. They're simply stuffed into these collections. In West Africa, though, the religion is based, the area, especially the area we're going, there is a basic underlying religion called Voodoo. We call it Voodoo, and we associated with what are called the dark arts. And if you can associate something with the dark arts, it means that you believe that there are dark arts in existence. Otherwise, you couldn't associate something with it, right? So I'm going to look at a little bit about West African voodoo, which is very different from the voodoo that we consider and think about, especially in the Caribbean and in the United States. But what we associate with West African religion, and particularly with voodoo, are masks, charms, which we call fetishes, and textiles of various kinds. I'm not going to go into textiles, but I can talk a little about textiles if we talk about beads in a separate and informal way. And of course, music and dance. And in Christianity also, music and dance has been very important, and charms have been very important, and masks not so much, but artwork has. Masks can be art, or they can be spirituality in West Africa. And they can, in many cases, these masks were collected, and some of them are extremely, extremely valuable. We'll go back. This one is a Fang mask, and it is important because it appeared around 1900 in France, and it was seen by Picasso, Matisse, and some of the other artists, and it inspired Cubism in their artwork. This one comes from a particular collection that was sold in 2006 for $7.5 million US. Now you can be certain that the guy who made it in West Africa did not get that amount, nor did he get his name put on the work of art. But this particular mask was one that had inspired some of the modern artists. In the 1930s, we had a number of artists, modern artists, that used West African art and used the masks that had been sort of stuffed away in those museums, and they went back and they found them, and they used them as inspiration. And some of them were not very pretty, but they were very meaningful to the original people who made them, because they were a sense of power. And I'm going to go back a little bit and retrace our steps, and we'll go back to the meaning of some of these masks when they were originally made. Obviously, they had a totally different meaning to Europeans, and particularly the artists, than they did to the guys who made them. This one is metal, and it's a fertility figure of the Akan, and we talked about the Akan. Another famous mask that is in Europe is the Gabon, from Gabon, and it is also a mask that was originally made for tranquility, for fertility, for balance of the universe, which these masks had some kind of purpose. Each mask was meant to do something to nature, meant to bring balance between humanity and the natural and supernatural world. And this one, again, is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Again, here are these guys in West Africa making these masks, and the Europeans have discovered them around 1900. Actually, Picasso discovered the first mask in 1906. He was introduced to it by Gertrude Stein and went to the museum, the Trocadero, and it just changed his outlook. All of a sudden, in 1906 to 1909, he went through the African period. And this is his famous African mask-inspired artwork, and these are the women of Avignon. This was a very controversial work of art, because these are prostitutes of Barcelona. And if you will see on the right there, I've got the face. Let me see if I can, there we go. That's the face of the mask, and it is thought that this mask, this Fang mask, actually inspired this face here. What does it mean? I'm not an aficionado or a follower of modern art. So for me, it's a matter of reading. It's not a matter of internalizing and feeling it. There are other people who are very much into feeling this type of art and connecting with it. And yet, there has been a lot of controversy about this art. Did he really use the African art in order to portray something that he felt was in the art and was missing in our world? And what he said was that art and African art had a soul and had a, there we go. Gertrude Stein explained it. She said about Picasso that it helped him understand his purpose as a painter, not to entertain, but to mediate between reality and creativity of the human mind, and to be free from fear of the unknown by giving form to it. In other words, her interpretation of what Picasso was seeing was the soul of the person behind the material body and behind the art. What was happening in Europe at this time was that you had the separation of the realists from the symbolic sense of the human being as a spiritual being. And you had a reaction toward Africa. Africa was divided up in 1885, 20 years before Picasso discovered West African art, and said, you know, these people are seeing something that we are missing. And in that African art, he saw a simplicity that led to what he explained as the human psyche or the human soul. Whether you believe that, whether you can understand that is a different matter. That is up to you. But that is how Picasso and his modern artists explain their concept of the attraction that they had to the modern art. And there are the left is the actual mask, and the right is the postulated inspiration, the way Picasso interpreted that mask. And yet, he said that no mask, no particular mask, was ever depicted in any of his paintings. So he would deny this totally. This was done by, academics and art historians who said, oh, this is where he got his inspiration. But this may not be the case. But indeed, he did get his inspiration from a lot of African art. He was able to take art out of the realism, the Vermeer, the Rubens, and the Renaissance detail to reality, to humanity, and he abstracted it. He made it into something that was not material and not real. And what he did was, this is Guernica. Guernica was bombed. It was a small town of 800 people, and in the First World War it was bombed, and they commissioned him to Picasso to paint a commemorative painting of that bombing. And he combined a number of African themes that came from different places, and I'm going to show you some of them where they came. The bull is from Guinea-Bissau, and we're going to see some of the bull cult. There are horses. You can't always put these things together and understand what is happening, but there is the fire of the bombs that were hitting, and there are dismembered people. And what he felt was that using these African techniques, which is the abstraction, he could convey the emotion in a way that you couldn't convey it through realism. You could look at a bombing, you could look at a site that has been bombed and where people are lying around who are injured and fatally injured, like the person down at the bottom, but he felt that in abstraction you could convert it into an emotional being. And there he has a mother with a dead child, and this was to him a much stronger statement than a reality of a mother with a child. And these are the dismembered parts, but behind the dismembered parts are newspapers. And those are the newspapers that talk about what is happening in the war situation. Now, if we look at what these masks really did, this is how they're used today. They're used in ceremonies. And these ceremonies, if you look at one of those masks, it's a little hard to see, and I'm going to see if I can play this again. There. This is from Cameroon, and one of those masks is an elephant mask, and we saw one like that in the museum yesterday. The masks are on top of these people's heads. These are the same masks that would have been used by the modern artists as their inspiration. But they're used in a totally different way in Africa from what they were used by Picasso and by the modern artists. He used them as the quest for the inner soul, and they're using it as a direct discussion or direct conversation with the ancestors. The masks are to them as this one scholar wrote, they're a telephone to the beyond. So in a way, there's some parallels there, and you see these guys are wearing their masks on top of their heads. And it doesn't make any difference where the mask is. It doesn't make any difference how the mask looks like. This is a pageant. It was done in Cameroon. We don't exactly know what this pageant was. I asked different people, I was there, these are my photos. I asked and I couldn't get a decent explanation ever of what these masks meant. So when the Europeans discovered this primitive art was in the 1870s. This was just at the time that Africa was being divided and the imperialism was spreading all over the world. India was being lost. The British were losing control over their colonies, and so they were very anxious to get the colonies in Africa. And this is the same time that the artists then were starting to discover the art of these colonies, not only of Africa, but of Asia as well. And this one is a receptacle for ancestral relics. What became known is that the one theme of all of this type of art in Western Africa is that it communicates with the beyond. And the beyond is the ancestors. So there is a connection. Then these masks speak and they connect to you, to your ancestors. They in themselves are not divine or holy objects. These are simply communication facilitators. And as one scholar noted, and since then it's been said, these are like a telephone to the beyond. And for that reason, they don't have to be realistic, because the ancestors have no realistic shape. It's irrelevant what the ancestor looks like. So you have the realistic art that they can do, but they don't need to do it, and they don't want to make it, because that's not its purpose. The purpose is communication. Who cares if the telephone is red or purple or yellow, as long as it communicates to the ancestors. And when the usefulness of that object is done, it is simply thrown away. It is just chucked. And then along come the Europeans, they find these things, and then they start selling them for millions of dollars because, oh, now it is art. But the purpose is to set the universe to order. This has a spiritual purpose. And every one of these masks was made for some purpose. In most cases, we do not know what the purpose is. And if you ask the African what the purpose is, even the practitioner, he won't know or she won't know what the purpose is. It is whatever I'm using it for. If I want to communicate with my great-grandmother or great-grandfather, that's what the purpose is. As soon as it's finished communication, it begins to lose its power. It doesn't have an innate power of its own. It is not a holy or spiritual object in itself. It is your spirituality that connects you to your ancestor that goes through this object. And this is a phallic object that is legba. And every village, especially in Togo and Benin, has a monument that is called a legba, and it is made to honor the principle that creates human fertility, the male principle. This mask, which is hard to see because this is an old photograph of it, and you'll see the name of the ceremony down at the bottom. This is a ceremony that this mask organizes the forces of the universe, and that's what the name of the mask is. This mask has been collected and in its form, and that's what it looks like in the museum. And it is a characteristic mask that always keeps the same shape. It is made over and over again. And it has a ritual, it has a dance, it has a regular celebration, and it is meant to organize the universe and make things right. And of course, remember the bull that we had, the bull in Picasso's Guernica. This is the bull mask. This comes from Guinea-Bissau, and it comes from the island of the Bijagos Islands. And we actually went. I went to the Bijagos on another trip several times, and we did see the whole ceremony of the bulls. And here you have the man dancing with that same bull mask that you saw that it was in Picasso's picture. This is an interesting society. This guy was dancing with a shark's fin. I have no idea. I asked people what that shark fin was. They live on an island. There are sharks around there. And he simply explained it as this is the replication of the shark itself. That's all we could get from it. And when I looked at it, and if you go and look on the internet and you look for some of the meaning of these things, you get a lot of nonsense from blogs, from people who have gone and asked different questions. You see the US flag up there? The guy is wearing a headdress he made from the US flag. And then you have the shark, and the shark also has a reptile in it and is carved, and he dances around. But the interesting thing is this guy, who was the man who danced with the bull mask. This is after he finished with the bull mask. He takes the bull mask off. It was very hot, very dusty. And we went several times, as I said, so we saw this over and over again, and it was always the same. It was always replicated. He is 34 years old. And what in this society they do, the men marry early, and they have children. And they have a wife. They have a family, like he did. And then at 32 or so, he goes off into a seclusion, and it's like a male monastery. And for 2 years, he becomes an initiate in the religious practices. And at that point, he gives up his wife and his family, and she can go off with somebody else. She usually remarries. And he was finished with his initiate rites. And so he returns to the village, and he's now a religious practitioner. And he will remarry. He said he will remarry because his wife, his former wife, is already married to somebody else and probably has children by somebody else. So he's got to find himself another wife. But he's now a religious practitioner of this religion, which they did not call voodoo, but it's very similar to some aspects of voodoo. And an important part of their religious practice is, of course, the use of charms and fetishes, which is something that all religions to some extent do and have. We have symbols, and in the case of these West African religions, and particularly in the case of what they call voodoo or Vodun, is these fetish dolls. And you will see the cowrie shells along the bottom. Cowrie shells are symbols of prosperity, and they had been money in the old days. And you see these dolls, and these dolls are also like the masks. They're meant to be a communication to the ancestors. Some of them, and these are called nkizis, they have little nails in them. Now, the nails are symbols of the iron, and iron workers, ironsmiths, blacksmiths are very important ritual practitioners because they control the efficiency of agriculture. The type of tools that a blacksmith makes will determine your family's prosperity if you're an agricultural people. And therefore, they have these dolls where you have the iron in it. Now you can see what happens to this in the Caribbean. This becomes the voodoo, the traditional voodoo doll that you put pins into to cause someone harm. This is not the way they function in West Africa. They can function as negative forces, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to make things right. If you have a relative who's sick, you go to a practitioner and he will make you a Nkizi doll, empower the Nkizi doll, and you will then take it home and hope that your relative or your child or your loved one gets better and recovers. When that Nkizi doll is finished, its power is done, it's just thrown out. It's finished. It doesn't have any power of its own. It is a communication to the spiritual beyond. And in voodoo and Vodun, the spiritual beyond is one God, Vodun, one being, one supreme being. But that supreme being is neither male nor female and has no physical form and must be reached through ritual and through certain practices. And sometimes the practices are abstinence of various kinds, giving up certain things, or going to a specialist. Every one of these voodoo villages, and this one is in Togo. We went to a number of villages in Togo and Benin that were voodoo villages. They always have a spirit house at the entrance. And the spirit house also has the symbol of the legba, which is the spirit of the phallic spirit. The house can be very plain, or the house can be very elaborate. And in the entrance to the village, there's always an altar, and the altar itself is called the legba. The altar gets what they call sacrifices, and these are not, there's no, there's nothing unusual about these sacrifices. It can be milk, it can be, sometimes they kill a chicken, and they'll dribble blood from the chicken, and then they eat the chicken. They cook it, and then they eat it. So they're always got dribbles over them, and you can come into the village and you can make your own sacrifices to it. In the old days, each of these villages, especially the villages that had special status in the Vodun religion, had fetish girls, and they had fetish priests. We know very little about these because not much has been written, and they were forbidden by the colonial powers very early. But really, these were very similar to the Vestal Virgins of ancient Rome and to the priestesses of Artemis. For instance, if anyone has been to Ephesus, you have the Artemisium there, and there you had the priestesses of Artemis, who were from 400 BC, and this is postulated that these fetish priestesses performed the same type of duties, some of which were considered sexual, and probably were. Fetish figures in different parts of the West African countries, all related to some form of voodoo, and voodoo take very different shapes. We don't know exactly. We have the Mkisi dolls, we know what they do, but we don't know much about the others. These are from European museums that have been collected, and of course they were collected without provenience and without their histories. Therefore, these particular objects and objects like that, which were forbidden to be made, we don't know anything about them. Now, if you look at the Mkisi doll closely, think about what we think about voodoo in the Caribbean. And it's very easy. What happened in the Caribbean and what happened in Louisiana and what happened in Brazil was that when the slaves were brought over, they were separated out by language groups, so that individual language groups were broken up so that people couldn't get together and rebel against their owners. And many of them were practitioners of voodoo, except they weren't priests. They were ordinary folks. And if you were told, any of you here were told, perform a Catholic ceremony, most of us, 99% of us wouldn't know what to do. How do you run the ritual? How do you run the whole ceremony itself? So you had these people who had a religion, and they couldn't speak easily to the other people in their community, and they were persecuted, and they were people in distress. They were hurting. So what was a natural thing to do? You remember the Mkisi dolls in your community, and you remember that the Mkisi doll had some kind of power, and it had the power to do evil or it had the power to do good. So what do you do at night? You make yourself an Mkisi doll and you put pins in it against the guy who's causing the distress, who owns you. And so voodoo got turned around into this painful religion that is an expression of people's suffering rather than an expression of people's connection to the beyond and to the outer world. Now, that is not all of the art of West Africa. West Africa also had a secular art that was portraiture. This is, though, on the right here is an actual portrait of a king of Benin. I think this is one of the Benin bronzes that they're hoping to get back. And some of them were political figures. They may have been stylized in various ways, but they represented specific figures. They were portraits. When we went to Elmina Castle, much of this was still, this is an ongoing religion. This is a live religion. This is not a past and dead religion. In Ghana, in Elmina Castle, the priest was conducting a ceremony. And it wasn't for us. It wasn't done because that we were visiting the castle. It was done because they needed to do it for themselves, because they're honoring the people who had been held in the dungeons of Elmina Castle, and they have their own ceremonies and tributes. This young man actually called the Backpacker blog. And he went to Togo and went through one of these Vodun ceremonies. and then he wrote about it. And he very clearly said he describes what happened, but he has no understanding of why it happened. It's very difficult to understand what is happening because, one, they don't explain it. The priest can't explain it and doesn't want to explain it. And one priest has his own ceremony and another one will have his ceremony, and you will choose if your grandma is sick. Well, I'm going to go to that one because that one's had a better track record. And he's got, fetishes that work a little bit better. And so that increases the creativity, that spurs the creativity and the divergence of the religion so that it becomes very personal. Each practitioner has his own secrets, and he will pass them only on to his initiates. Togo has a very famous fetish market, and the fetishes are animals. Many of them are illegal. You cannot hunt them, and people ignore that, and they hunt them, and they use them for their ceremonies. And this is where, I've got eye of newt and tongue of dog. That old Europeans also believed in the use of animal parts for fetishes that had some kind of power. In the 20th century, this still continues. This is an active religion. And even though it constantly changes and transforms, it is enduring. And this religion is probably older than 2,000 years, so it probably predates Christianity. This is the lake Nokwe, which is a voodoo area. And now what these people have done is they've actually put on a whole show for tourists. This is Egungun. Egungun is an ancestral spirit. You cannot see his body as a human being. It is illegal, or it is against principle to see his body. And what they did was they built this community center. And we were there the first year. The community center only had a floor. And little by little, they established this into a whole educational institution for tourists. So you go into the lake, you go across Nokwe, and you go in a cayuco in one of the dugout boats, and you get to their village of Ganbie, and there they put on a show for you, and they explain as much as they're willing to explain, which is not everything, so you end up with more questions than you have answers. But it is the basic, the way they have managed to transform a part of their religion into prosperity, because you buy things there and the tours pay to go there, so they then use it for developing of the community. And this is our buffalo mask on the left from Roxa Island, but you've got buffalo masks in other countries as well, with people who speak completely different languages. And that is from the Bijagos of Guinea-Bissau, and this buffalo mask is from Burkina Faso. If you put these two men together, they would probably not have much in common to talk about, even though they're using the same symbols and the same objects. Oops, did I just go backward? Yeah, so these are ancestral figures that connect to the you, to the beyond, and after you're finished with it, you just throw it away, so collectors come and they get these figures and they sell them, basically. And we have the Asante stool, which is not the original gold stool, but a sample, but these are the ones that are sold if you want one in your house. And you will use this to connect to your ancestors and talk to your ancestors. And then when you are finished, you simply put it away, put it under a table, or let the kids play with it, and then bring it out when you need to call your ancestor as well. These are villages in Togo, Sanguera, and these are the voodoo ceremonies that they put on for us. The white dots represent purity and water, and this is, they use a part of the voodoo ceremony that is a pageant. It is a story. And these children, led by this woman, are coming in. Now you will see on the left a woman who's trying to get a little kid to participate in this. There's the little kid. The kid won't move, won't join the older children. And what they do now is they've come into the village from outside, and the pageant actually builds up by bringing people in from different places, symbolic. And there's always the old woman. The old woman represents the ancestress, and you see they do a little ritual, and the ritual involves water, because water is purity. Now look at the woman on the right. Do you see what she has in her hand? That's the plastic telephone. She's calling the ancestors. So when they say they're dealing with the ancestors and it's like a telephone, they literally mean it. They're calling their ancestors. There is another part of arts and dance in Africa that is purely artistic, and this is from the United States. There used to be also the ballets africains from Senegal that came and performed in New York and traveled all over the United States and all over the world, actually, which has been disbanded, unfortunately. The original palace in Benin City was decorated with decorative bronzes that were not religious. These were secular. Many of them ended up in England, and that is they're the subject of the repatriation effort right now. And it's realistic art that is art for art's sake, separate from religion. They can do it, and they have done it. And they don't make those masks because they don't know any better, or they're childlike, or they're undeveloped. They do it because the masks, the religious masks, serve a purpose. This is the Benin bronzes that were stolen after Africa was divided. And the Europeans brought it. There's some in Britain, there's some in Germany, and they want them back. And you can see here, this Benin bronze has the manila on it. It's a Portuguese soldier, and he has the symbols of the money that was used in the slave trade. The specialists are the blacksmiths, and always have been ever since iron was discovered, because they have the power to give you the tools to create food. So God gives them the power and the talent and the knowledge, and they pass it on to human beings. And that's a very interesting twist to this day. You will see these things, and you may see some in the market. These are asan. Asan are pieces, they're symbolic of rain and prosperity in the fields and agriculture. And if you see them, they're all right to buy. They're not necessarily antiques or art collections, but you can buy it. You put it in your garden and your field, and it attracts positive positive vibes and positive outcomes. Iron workers are also artists, and not only do they create spiritual things and things that contribute to our survival, but they create pure works of art. And some of these are from the museums, from various blacksmiths. So there you have it. You have African art that is religious and African art that is purely for art's sake, that is made to just enhance the human soul and the aesthetic. Thank you very much.